Okay. Hi, everybody. For those of you tuning in, it's been a while. We are the FDP IACUCs and Subawards Subcommittees, and this is actually a work group session where we are going to be talking about the hot topic of memorandums of understandings and different types of agreements when we're collaborating with other institutions working with vertebrate animals. And so we'll just quickly go around. I'm Stephanie Scott. I'm the FDP Subawards, currently the FDP Subawards Subcommittee co-chair. With me is... Any of you can introduce yourselves.
Okay, I'm Axel Wolf. I'm the Deputy Director of OLAW, and I'm one of the subcommittee co-chairs as a federal partner.
Great.
And I'm Ara Tamasian from Harvard University. I'm the Chief Research Compliance Officer and co-chair with Axel of the subcommittee.
And my name is Amanda Humphrey. I am also one of the FDP Subawards Subcommittee co-chairs. So I look forward to the session.
Excellent. So here's what's on the agenda. We're going to do a very quick recap of where we left off. I know that there's quite a few people here who may have never attended a previous session before, or may have attended but didn't attend our last work group meeting, which was several months ago. And as everyone here knows, about the current state of events and affairs, that COVID-19 hit. And we were originally going to have this session about 2 months ago, but we had to postpone. And now we're ready to get cracking again and working with this group. Quick recap of where we left off. Remind folks of some basic definitions, which I'll show you in a bit. And we have a guest speaker today. I'd like to introduce Alice Huang, who is with the Department of Veteran Affairs, the VA, who is a staff scientist and deputy for IACUC Guidance. She is going to be doing a presentation about the VA's MOU tool. And we thought that this would be great to have as a point of discussion about our next steps. Because during the January 2020 in-person meeting that we had, and can you believe it was 6 months ago that we since met in person, she attended that session and mentioned the VA's MOU tool. And we were really interested in seeing it, how they constructed it, why they chose to use an MOU for collaborations as opposed to other instruments. And so we thought this would be a great learning opportunity. So we welcome you, Alice.
Thank you.
And after her presentation, we're going to have some discussion and Q&A, and then talk about some next steps and action items. And so just what's our ultimate goal of this work group? And so we've posed these questions previously in our webinar that we conducted back in October, which is how do you ensure that roles and responsibilities are defined when more than one institution is conducting work with vertebrate animals funded by the same grant? And the same question applies if there is no sponsored funding, if there is no grant. And what type of agreement should be used between collaborating institutions that will ensure the appropriate individuals are aware of each of their roles? And that's really what stirred this whole work group, is the argument and the pros and the cons of, should we address collaborations with the handling of animals in the subaward, or should it be a separate agreement, an MOU? And we've heard a lot of argument for both during the January session. And then since then, when we did have a meeting, we talked about further defining and further having the need for written guidance on the purposes, on the purpose of each of these types of agreements. Hold on one second. Here we go. And then what's the least burdensome way to do this? What's the least burdensome way for us to achieve our goal, which is deciding what is the type of agreement or language that should be used for the two entities, or even more than two entities, to be aware and to further define each other's roles. And if any of my co-chairs or co-presenters, want to chime in if I missed anything, please feel free to step in. This is just language. It's the paragraph of which this all stems from, this very short paragraph in the guide for, and of course my, the guide for the care and use of laboratory animals, the 8th edition, which is guidance. Notice how I didn't say mandate, but guidance on interinstitutional collaborations. I'm not going to read through the whole paragraph, but the key thing there, which I have bolded in red, is that participating institutions should have a formal written understanding, which could be a contract, memorandum of understanding, or agreement that addresses the responsibility for off-site animal care and use and animal ownership. And so it's a should statement, but it's very strongly expected, especially because the purpose, and what we've discussed in previous meetings, is that the purpose of these agreements of MOUs or whatever formal written understanding you have in place, the purpose is to define roles and responsibilities to prevent an issue happening with an animal. Okay. And so these are the 3 definitions that we've discussed before, and I know Alice is going to touch on all of these as well in her presentation, which is let's define what each of these things are. They are 3 distinct mechanisms. The MOU, which I say, the thing with MOUs is that they're not legally binding contracts. They are used to outline the roles and responsibilities between institutions. So it's used in circumstances that involve these partnerships between collaborating institutions involving animal activity. An IIA, an interinstitutional assurance, is required when the awardee institution does not have its own animal program and will conduct the animal activity at a secondary assured institution named as the performance site. We actually had this question come up a few days ago, Amanda, I think, where someone was asking, I'm not sure what the appropriate mechanism is when I'm working with an institution that doesn't have an IACUC. What should I be using? Should I be using a subaward? Should I be? And so I would say that this is the mechanism that you would be using if indeed PH funds are involved. I actually don't know, and Axel probably knows this, if there aren't PHS funds involved. I'm wondering what type of instrument they would use, or is the IIA used for any type of funding arrangement?
Well, you could use it for any type of arrangement because assurances are applicable to programs, but you're not necessarily bound to, but it's not a good idea to have dual standards in place.
Great. And then finally, the 3rd distinct instrument is the subaward, which is used to document and flow down terms and conditions of the collaboration between the parties. And currently, the terms and conditions do offer choices to collect the IACUC approval letter. And so the subaward, it wasn't designed to take the place of an MOU outlining those roles and responsibilities. What it was to do was to flow down the policies and terms from the primary sponsor, and also to very explicitly state that you're not going to get reimbursed for any expenses unless you have an IACUC approval letter in place at your institution. I do see 1 or 2 questions coming up. For the IIA, so this question might be for you, Axel. For the IIA, is that used only for federally supported collaborations?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interinstitutional assurance, so assurance goes through OLAW. OLAW is in charge of PHS work and NSF work as far as oversight goes. So it would be specifically for the type of awards that come from NIH.
If there were awards that didn't come from NIH, do you think that they would use some other type of instrument?
Well, when I say NIH, I also mean anything else that we oversee through the Public Health Service or through the National Science Foundation. But
Ah,
otherwise, we wouldn't be issuing assurances for non-funded work, correct?
okay. Here's another, oh, the questions are already coming in. What about just a plain signed contract as another form of written agreement? I guess as opposed to the ones I mentioned.
They wouldn't cover the same ground as an interinstitutional assurance, nor as a memorandum of understanding. As far as subawards, you can probably answer that better than I can.
Yeah. Oh, Amanda. Okay, go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, a contract is just like the legal mechanism. I always would joke with one of my friends that, like, we could call it Bob and it would still be a contract just because you call it Bob. You know, if it contains the things you need it to contain, then it is that document, right? So all of these things maybe have different levels of enforceability, but I think what they all represent is a written understanding between two parties about the care and use of animals, and they're going to cover different pieces of content depending on the specifics of the situation. But whatever you're calling them at your institution, I think it's really about what is the intent behind the document. And the memorandum of understanding is, you have an assurance, I have an assurance, you're going to be doing your own work over there, I'm going to be doing my own work over here, and we're just going to work together to make sure that we understand what's happening with our respective animals. And the subaward is kind of more about the programmatic science piece, and just, okay, and it covers that transfer of funds and a lot of other obligations that are kind of outside of the care and use of animals.
So we have a question here. It says, why is the transport of animals excluded in the agreement? Which agreement are you referring to?
So usually with an MO, I'm guessing they're referring to the MOU. Is that correct?
I'm not
Actually,
sure.
this is Carol. I was trying to get off of mute.
Oh, sure.
Sorry, I tuned in late, but there was a slide earlier to this, and it read through the PHS, this, and it said beyond, what does it say here? Beyond animal transport. And, you know, from our experience with collaborations in general, that the transport is part of that process, which sometimes gets overlooked. So, you know, that's why I'm asking.
Carol, this goes above and beyond it. That's why it says beyond animal transport. Animal transport is clearly an area where problems can occur. That's why this expands upon it.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Axel.
Thanks.
Sure.
Thanks for clarifying. Okay.
And I have seen specific animal transport agreements that just cover that end-to-end, leaves one loading dock, goes to the other loading dock time.
Right, and that's also in addition to the contractual agreement you may have with a commercial transporter. So that's another document that we're not even addressing here. And that's why the MOU part here goes above and beyond animal transport, because there could be other permutations as far as planes or ground shipment and stuff like that. And then if it's a USDA covered animal, that of course would be then covered by the Animal Welfare Act.
Great. And so with the question that just came in, yours is a very specific question, and if we have time, we could get to it later today. I mean, later toward the end of the presentation in the Q&A, but we might have to address it with you directly. So just real quick, what we discovered during the last webinar when we were polling our attendees, does your institution issue MOUs when multiple institutions are working with vertebrate animals on the same research project? And as you can see, it's very widely spread, where 34% they always do, 10%, even if there is a subaward. So in addition to a subaward, they have an MOU. 10% will do it only if there is no subaward. About a quarter of the attendees say they don't issue MOUs, and a third didn't know. And then when you are a subrecipient on an NIH-funded project, where do you report any animal welfare issues? So this is the reporting. 9% of subrecipients report directly to OLAW with no notification to the pass-through entity. 44% report directly to OLAW with notification to the PTE, and 12% just do it to the PTE. But a good third, 35%, wasn't sure what the process is. And then finally, how was operational alignment between your institution's IACUC office when issuing MOUs and the office that issues subawards? And only 18% said that the MOU process and the subaward process are closely aligned. So with that, without further ado, before I hand it off to Alice, I just wanted to say that I did send a link earlier, and it's also included with these slides, of the template tool that she's referring to, and you are more than welcome to test it out for yourselves when she's done with her presentation. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Alice, you can now share your screen and take it away.
Thank you, Stephanie. Let me just get this turned on. And come on.
We see it.
Yeah, there. Okay, now it's real. Okay, so thank you very much. My focus is on MOUs. I really don't know much about subawards or anything, but I'm hoping that this information might be useful to you in your process. So the first thing that I needed to do was to sort out the distinctions between these three kinds of documents. So I put it together this way. I hope this may be useful to other people as well as to me. So the IAA is something that OLAW requires. Nobody else requires it. And the people who are, or the parties that are involved in that are OLAW and the primary awardee who doesn't have an animal program. And this applies just to PHS funding. So this is when you have the conduct of research with animals at a secondary assured institution when the primary awardee doesn't have an animal program. And the focus of this whole thing is to make sure that the primary awardee promises that they're only going to conduct research with animals at this secondary institution that is assured. So this is really between OLA and the primary, and it has to do with making sure that the work does get done somewhere that is assured. The subaward, as I understand it, is something that's required by NIH, and that is between the primary awardee and the other institution. Again, this has to do specifically with PHS funding, and it has to do with the transfer of PHS funds from the primary awardee to the other institution. And it kind of says, this is what you have to do to get your money. And then the MOU, which is what I'm going to talk about, is something that's required, recommended by the guide. So it's not specific to NIH or OLA. It applies to anybody who pays attention to the guide. And it is between the collaborating institutions, which both have some sort of animal program. So again, it doesn't involve OLA or NIH specifically. It doesn't care where the funding comes from. And it applies to the collaboration that's related to research with animals. So the subaward doesn't necessarily have to do with animals. The MOU definitely, the MOUs we're going to talk about have to do with research with animals. And the whole focus is how do we coordinate the efforts to share the responsibilities with animals, about animals. So I have okay, this is a picture of how I see this all fitting together. So if we look at all the things that get NIH funding, then we look at all the research that's done with animals. Well, there's some overlap. Some of the research with animals is funded by NIH and some isn't. Then the subaward is only for NIH funding, and some of it has to do with research with animals and some of it doesn't. And then then you have the IIA, which is specifically to do with research with animals, and it has to be with NIH funding, but only some of them are projects that involve subawards. They might not they might choose not to exchange funds, transfer funds. And then we have the MOU, which overlaps with all of them except the IIA, but it also applies to research that doesn't have anything to do with NIH. So that's sort of how I sorted this out. Okay, so we're going to focus on the MOU for collaborative animal research and try to address the questions, why do we bother and what should be in it? So I'm going to do this with a short story that is totally fabricated but is kind of plausible that might help people who aren't familiar with the MOU to understand why we bother. So the cast of characters include an eager young reporter. There's a Dr. Newby, who's an assistant professor at Great Big University, and he has a breeding colony of mice with special phenotypes that he studies. Then there's Dr. Fresh, who's the hometown VA investigator, and he studies the behavior of mice running a special maze that he designed. Then we've got Joe, who's an animal care technician at Great Big University. And then we've got Becky, who's the technician at hometown VA. And then there's the Dean of Research at Great Big University and the hometown VA director. So the story goes that Dr. Newby was really excited about having just gotten his first NIH research grant. It was for a study of how performance is impacted by stress, which he planned to study by observing how well mice do in a maze, comparing those that have to work their way through the maze right after being transported across town with those that get 3 days to acclimate to their new surroundings after being transported before they have to deal with the maze. So Dr. Newby has his colony of mice at Great Big University with special phenotypes that he thinks will help to demonstrate the mechanisms underlying the effects of stress on performance. His friend, Dr. Fresh, had recently gotten an appointment at the local VA and had already set up a maze in the animal facility at the VA for his own studies. And Dr. Fresh was very enthusiastic about letting Dr. Newby run some mice through his maze. So Dr. Newby carefully prepared his protocol for review by the IACUC at Great Big University. He explained in the protocol that he needed to time the transportation of the mice to the VA so that they could be tested in the maze immediately on arrival. Because it's hard to arrange timing like that with the animal transport services of the university's lab animal department, he asked to transport the mice in his own car, and he explained how he would keep the animals secure and comfortable in their cages, ensure that the transportation would be discreet, and avoid contaminating either his car or the cages. The IACUC reviewed the protocol, asked for some clarifications, and then approved it. Dr. Fresh had worked with Great Big University in the past, and he knew that their IACUC was meticulous about making sure that everything is the way it should be before he grants approval. So he heartily congratulated Dr. Newby when the approval was granted, and the two of them set about scheduling the experiments. On September 2, Dr. Newby transported the first set of 12 mice from the university over to the VA. He and Dr. Fresh studied 6 of the mice in the maze and put the other 6 in cages, carefully labeled to show that they're part of Dr. Newby's NIH-sponsored study at the U, and providing contact information for both Dr. Newby and Dr. Fresh. And that was a good thing because later, when Joe, a member of the husbandry staff at the VA, noticed the new cages and called Dr. Fresh to check on whether there were any special husbandry instructions. So it was good that the contact information was there. Dr. Fresh assured him that those are the animals on the NIH study belonging to the U, so the animal care technicians from the U would be coming over to the VA to provide husbandry according to the SOPs at the U. Unfortunately, Dr. Newby had assured the animal facility personnel at the U that husbandry would be provided by the very competent VA staff members while the animals were on VA property. So there was no need for animal care technicians from the university to worry about the off-site animals. On September 3rd, as Dr. Newby was loading his car with the next 12 mice to go to the VA, he happened to be observed by an eager young reporter who thinks animal research is fascinating and thought it would be great to write something about the wonderful work being done locally. He didn't want to bother the busy investigators, and he had just participated in a workshop about accessing information through open records requests, so he went off to see what he could learn through an open records request about animal research at Great Big University. After Dr. Newby and Dr. Fresh finished studying the 6 new immediate mice on September 3rd and got the 6 new acclimation mice settled in their new cages, Dr. Newby looked in on the 6 mice that he had brought over the day before and were now completing day 1 of their acclimation period. He was surprised to see that it didn't look like they had gotten any fresh food or water since he had left them. He didn't see any of the VA animal care personnel as he was leaving, so as soon as he got back to the university, he mentioned to Becky, who helps him with his breeding colony at the U, that there seemed to have been some sort of mix-up. So Becky immediately offered to go over to the VA and take care of the newbie mice. Unbeknownst to Dr. Newby and Becky, though, Joe had stopped in to check on the newbie mice shortly after Dr. Newby left because he wanted to make sure they had been cared for. As it didn't look like they had, he went off to find out what the protocol said about any special husbandry these mice needed. While he was gone, Becky arrived, fed and watered the mice, and left. Joe couldn't find a copy of the protocol, so he went back to the mouse room to get Dr. Fresh's phone number and found the mice now had fresh food and full water bottles. Joe got even more confused when Dr. Fresh said that he didn't have a copy of the protocol because it was approved by the university IACUC. When the state open records request reached the university, the IACUC, the veterinarian, the animal facility supervisor, and the IACUC administrator there worked closely with the university's public affairs department to respond promptly in compliance with the open records requirements. The VA director was then blindsided a few weeks later when he was asked during a press conference about the new opening of a new VA clinic in town for his response to the article about collaboration of the VA and the university in animal research, which had been published that morning, but which he didn't know anything about. When he mentioned this to his friend, the dean of research at the university, the dean looked into it and learned that the people who had worked on the response had hoped to spare the VA the bother, especially as the state open records requirements don't apply to VA anyway. So we've got a story where everybody involved was doing, had the best of intentions, but something went wrong. It's pretty mixed up. So what went wrong was Murphy's Law at work. We had a bunch of incorrect assumptions, we had inadequate communication, and we had confusion about roles. So how could an MOU help with this? Well, for the incorrect assumptions, the MOU can help you define what the expectations are, so everybody has is literally on the same page. Inadequate communication, the MOU can help to identify who the points of contact are and what matters need to be communicated routinely. And then for confusion about roles, the MOU can help by actually assigning roles. The result is then less confusion, more efficiency and cooperation, and improved regulatory compliance, and which is better for everybody. Okay, so this is the question that we kept getting after even before, but after the guide came out was, do you have a sample we can use? And we always said, no, we have maybe some sort of examples, but anyway, we finally decided it was time to try to put something together. And the focus of what we tried to put together was, what do we need to put in here to make the collaboration work? We needed to identify areas of potential confusion and propose ways to address them. And we wanted to allow flexibility for local needs because every collaboration is a little bit different. So the VA's MOU Template Tool, which here again is the link to that you can get to it by. It's on a public-facing website, so anybody is welcome to use it. It has a few VA-specific elements, but mostly VA's requirements are that the program comply with OLA and USDA. So for the most part, the tool will work for everybody. But basically, the whole thing is designed for you to pick and choose what's useful, so you can just delete the pieces that are VA-specific. So. And it's done in a bunch of sections. Section A just identifies who are the parties involved. And Section B focuses on what's the point of the MOU. And we put in a little sort of philosophical piece there, that the point of the MOU is not to try to bind anybody to anything or to provide a tool for enforcement. It's based on the assumption that everybody knows that the collaboration fundamentally depends on good faith efforts on everybody's part to make it work, and that sometimes it's useful to write down what everybody's part is. So Part C talks about what rules do the parties agree to comply with, and these are all the expected ones: the Animal Welfare Act, PHS policy, ALAC rules of accreditation, the guide, and any institutional policies on either side. So D is again fairly general. What general principles do the parties agree to? So what's covered by the MOU is addressed here. Who interprets the regulatory requirements? So in the way we've written it, we said whoever published and enforces the regulation gets to interpret what they're supposed to mean. So OLA interprets PHS policy. It's supposed to address the ownership of the animals. It's supposed to address the access to facilities and information, and it emphasizes the importance of communication. So that's all in part D. And then E is saying, all right, so who's going to take care of these things? When we're sharing facilities, who's going to hold the USDA registration and take care of the reporting that's required? Who's going to take care of the PHS assurance? Who's going to make sure about ALAC accreditation? Who's going to make sure the animals get the veterinary care and the routine husbandry? This was the issue between Joe and Becky. And what about health coverage? Who's going to make sure that everybody is covered the way they're supposed to? F talks about how we're going to share oversight, because both sides bear some responsibility for protocol review and approval, for semi-annual evaluations, for addressing noncompliance, and all of those things. It may be, the work may be done more at one place than the other, but the others, you can't, one side can't wash their hands of it. Okay, so we needed some language to make sure that both sides stay fully informed. Both sides have the authority to act with regard to the collaborative work, and that the actions of both sides are coordinated and cooperative. So you don't want people working at cross purposes. And of course, you want to minimize duplication of effort. Then, so part of the sharing of information is what information exactly do we want shared and how? So part G contains an agreement to share. It contains the conditions for redaction. And it lists some specific documents of interest. Obviously, you can add to that or delete from that as is appropriate for your situation. And what about other information of interest? How are you going to make sure that both parties get the information they need? And then identifying the points of contact, so you know who to ask if there's if you're missing some information that you need. And then H is what the lawyers helped us put in. It says how's the MOU itself going to be managed? How often is it going to be renewed? Is it going to terminate? What do you do about disputes and getting signatures? So again, this is my Venn diagram. We have research with animals, some of which is funded by NIH, and some of the research with or without animals involves a subaward. Some of the research with animals funded by NIH that is or is not covered by a subaward requires an IIA. And then the MOU that we talked about covers a little bit of everything and some extra stuff. So here again is the table that I used, again focusing that the MOU is required by the guide, and it really is intended to make collaboration easier. It doesn't bind anybody to anything. It doesn't have anything to do with money. It actually doesn't care where the money comes from. It's just making sure that everybody knows what everybody else expects and understands about this collaboration. So that's it. And if there are any questions, I will be very happy to try to respond. If I can't answer on right now, I will be happy to provide written responses later.
Thank you so much for that. Let me just see first if we have any initial questions, and feel free, you can raise your hand, put something in the chat. You can unmute yourselves if you want to verbally ask a question. Would it be possible, Alice, if we did I know we said we weren't going to go into detail about it, but I think it would be great if you did a little bit of a walkthrough of the tool itself, just to show how it was put together. Should I share my screen, or do you want to share yours?
If you go ahead and share it, we can.
Great.
I don't think we'll want to go through all the gory details, but
Right.
I can tell you how it works.
That would be great. So
Sure.
I'll share my screen. There we go.
Okay. So this whole first page or so is just instructions, and what it says is, don't get too hung up on this thing because it's really, really long. All the stuff in curly brackets and italics are just sort of comments and notes to you to understand what we're trying to get at with this piece. The numbering of the items is also, a lot of it's in curly brackets and italics, just so that, but it's to help organize it so you can see what's going on. And so what you do right there in the middle, it says you enter the information that's requested, and you select the options that apply. So a lot of places in this tool, it says, okay, pick one of the next 6 options. So you pick the one that works for you, and then you delete all the other ones. Then when you're done with going through it that way, then you save your draft, and then you have one that actually applies to your particular situation. You don't have to worry about all those other options that are not relevant to you. Okay, you can scroll down a little bit, and I can.
Oh, you're cutting out a little bit, or is it me?
Ola, and there shouldn't be anything in here that conflicts with any of their requirements. As I said, there's a few.
Uh-oh. Can you hear me? Uh-oh.
Pardon? What did they let me share my slide?
Okay, so then I think you probably are. Then it might be easier.
So
I'm back.
Oh, okay.
So you know what? Just in case, yeah, I'll add Amanda as a co-host, and I'll add you as a co-host, which I think you might have done. Make co-host. Great. And Amanda. Yeah, my internet clonked out.
Yeah, so Alice, you may want to just go ahead and share.
Yeah, I'm pulling up a copy. This is gonna take me a second.
There you go. Apologies.
No problem. It's amazing that this works at all.
And we're still recording, believe it or not.
Okay, oops, open. Well, it's thinking about opening it. Okay, now, all right, so if I can share my screen again, then let's see, how do I get there? Share screen. Okay, there we go.
There we go.
You see it?
We're back in business, yes.
Okay, all right, so this is the MOU tool. Come on. And that's where we were before. So I'm going to just scroll down. That's all instructions. Here's where the tool actually starts. And so you can see, I was talking about the curly brackets and stuff. It says memorandum of understanding between, and then we have, I think they're curly brackets. I can't even see them now. But anyway, brackets and italics that say, enter the name of the VA facility here. And then enter the name of the collaborating institution. And then, so it prompts you what to put in where. And some people wanted to have the signatures up at the top instead of at the end. And so we said, okay, well, if you want to, you can move item H7 here. So then it's right at the beginning. Then this is, so who's involved in the MOU? You have the VA facility, and then you choose an abbreviation. So you can, find and replace throughout the document so that it always refers to whatever abbreviation you use. And then the second one is the name of the collaborating institution, and then they get to choose an abbreviation. And then this part B, this is this sort of philosophical bit that I said, that collaborative endeavors depend fundamentally on the good faith efforts of all parties involved. I mean, if you have a collaboration and both sides are trying to get the better of the other, it's not going to work. It doesn't matter if you have an MOU or not. So the point is that you assume that there are going to be good faith efforts, and then how do you help that be healthy, cooperative, and mutually beneficial? And so the MOU is to facilitate those good faith efforts by defining the expectations and so on. And then C is just this long list of references that we refer to: the Animal Welfare Act, the Health Research Extension Act, and the Guide, and the ALAC rules of accreditation, and so on and so forth. And then these are the general stipulations. So these you pretty much, unless there's somebody objects to one of them, you just kind of plop them all in and leave them there. So, but here under D1, there's a little bit of an explanation of why we put this one in. So that's why it matters. So D is all that. Okay, E. Now here's where we start getting into here's your options, choose one. So this has to do with the facilities. And so the first one says, okay, well, they have to be, we're going to say that both facilities, or there needs to be some kind of registration with USDA if you're going to involve animals that are regulated by USDA. But there's a bunch of different ways that you can do that. And so then you get to select one of the 5 options. So only the VA has a registration. Well, in that case, the collaborative work involving regulated species can only be done at the VA, and the VA will report all of them. Or only the collaborating institution is registered, and the VA isn't. And then all work has to be done at the collaborating institution, and they're going to report everything. Or maybe both of them have registrations, and so then you have to decide who's going to do the reporting, because you don't want to report animals twice. Let's see, E1C says, well, we'll base it on where they're housed. And E1D says, we'll base it on who owns them, and so on. So, you know, obviously you would just choose one. And then E1E just says, if you've got some other arrangement in mind, you can put it here. And then you would delete all the other ones that don't apply.
So I'm going to stop you just for a second for a couple of questions
Sure.
that have come in, but also I'm just going to throw a general one. What was the VA's, I guess, thought process or what led to the decision to go this route with using an MOU as opposed to another type of contracting tool?
So we really didn't, there really wasn't any conversation about other tools. There was a sense that this should not be a contract. And in fact, so we ran, besides running this by OLA and USDA, we also sent it by the lawyers at the VA. And they explained to me that because as an MOU, you know, we don't want this to be a contract. And they were very careful to remove contractual language. So where we used to say must some places, and they said, no, you can't say must because that's a contractual language thing. And so you'll see that it doesn't come up very often. And I think it's in the spirit of this that it's not intended to be an enforcement tool so much, I mean, an instrument of enforcement so much as an instrument to facilitate collaboration. So if there's money exchange involved, VA says, well, you need to have a separate contract. And we've had, like, there's one place I know where they actually wrote a different agreement. It's called a collaborative research and development agreement. And then they put this MOU at the end of it as an amendment. But if there's actually money, I think there's actually a statement in here somewhere that if this gets to be a situation where you're going to have money changing hands, I think I'm trying to think where it is. I think it's up here somewhere. Yeah. Well, no, I won't. I'm not going to scroll up and down, that then you should have a separate contract
Right.
to
So,
do that.
I think that's so interesting and part of the crux of the conversation and some of the debates that we've been having internally in the work group with the pros and the cons.
Yeah.
And that at your institution, you know, this is strictly a collaboration agreement defining the roles, whereas I've heard from other institutions, they've made this contractual.
Right.
And so, you know, I have one person who wrote in here, our institution has quote unquote animal terms and conditions. Notice how that, which we attach to all outgoing subaward agreements and outgoing service agreements that involve animal research being conducted at the subrecipient contractor site. This process works fairly well for us. We've never used separate MOUs, to my understanding. We're comparing our attachment language to what's in the VA MOU and making sure it covers everything, meet the OLAW strong suggestion to have an MOU. So
I think you could, that would work, that would be fine. It would meet the it would meet what the guide asks for. I think one thing that might be worth thinking about is that when you connect the MOU to a subaward, then it really applies to just that subaward. You need another one for the next subaward or for a non-NIH funded something or other. Whereas the MOU, this kind of MOU covers, it's a general thing that applies to every collaboration, or however you want to write it. I mean, we've had some, in some VAs say, well, we only want this to apply to work by this particular investigator. So you can do that too. But the idea is that this has the potential for being a general agreement between the two institutions, and you can apply it to whatever work is funded by whoever.
That's very interesting, because now we're getting into the project specific discussion, right? How project specific do these MOUs have to be? And I don't know.
Well, and in some cases they need to be, you know, that, so we have some cases where the VA says, well, we're fine with the collaborating about this project, but we aren't real happy about the idea of expanding this to anything else. So we're going to write this in a very limited way. It's only for this investigator doing this project. And others say, well, we've got so many collaborative endeavors going on that, I mean, the VA and the affiliate are really closely, they're physically close together and they work closely together. Most of the investigators have joint appointments. So we want a broad MOU that covers all of them, the sort of the default of who's going to take care of the animals as soon as they show up over there. And so, you know, that part is really up to the local, or up to the institutions involved, how they want to define it.
And then another question came in, how often do two institutions revisit the MOU?
So originally we had put in section H about how you manage the MOU, we had said something about they should renew, that it should expire after 3 years or 5 years or something like that. And then, but this version actually took that out. It does say, let me see if I can get there. It does say that both parties are supposed to review it annually, just to make sure things didn't change. You know, maybe you weren't using regulated species before and now somebody wants to. Here, H3, this MOU will remain in effect indefinitely, okay? And H2 above specifies that it's to be reviewed annually. So indefinitely here merely reduces the risk of a lapse. You can obviously put in any interval that you want if the parties want to put in a time, you know, 3 years, 5 years, 2 years, whatever. But by saying indefinite, we made it so that you don't have to freak out because the deadline's coming up. Nothing has changed, but you know, you have to get the lawyers involved and you have to do this whole document over again. You know, it counts on people actually doing the annual review in case anything has changed. So
I'm curious to hear other people's thoughts on what they've seen so far, kinds of questions you may have. And I'm also thinking, you know, and feel free to chime in, Amanda or Axel or Ara, on some of your thoughts on this. But to me, what's really interesting again is that whole point of this is a collaborative arrangement. It seems like with your tool, you're putting in a lot of flexibility depending on the nature of the relationship between the two institutions.
Well, the tool is very flexible, and
Yeah.
the institutions can choose to make it very restricted if they want to.
I see.
And so where there's you know, where there's funding involved, where there's transfer of funds, or the need for an assurance, you know, it's appropriate for those to be more enforcement oriented. You know, if you don't do this, you don't get the money, kind of thing. Whereas this really, there is no stick involved. It has to do with how are we going to work best together.
And that's probably the key here. That's it. Okay, we got another one. If this MOU sample was attached to a subaward agreement, expiration should align with subaward expiration, right? Asking since indefinitely, the word indefinitely was used.
Yeah, and that's fine. So the indefinite there is to say that VA is not recommending in general that everybody has to renew it after X number of years, and that indefinite is fine. But as it says here, any shorter interval that the parties prefer may be specified here instead. So, you know, if you have a subaward that goes for a certain number of months or years or whatever, you can certainly put that in.
What
I think one thing.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No,
I
go
think
ahead.
one thing that's also important to clarify about this is sometimes a collaboration may extend beyond one research project. And so there might be a single protocol, but there's actually like 3 streams of funding, some coming online at various points in time while others are coming offline. So there may be an additional benefit to the broader language that's used in an MOU like this, so that investigators don't have to go back and revisit stuff under the same protocol as long as that protocol is kind of happening. So you might have 3 or 4 subawards that are all related to the same IACUC protocol, and you've got that one MOU potentially in the background that is applying when the grant is applicable.
Well, and you know, you could always reference the MOU in each of the subawards or each of the protocols or whatever, or the other way around. You know, the MOU can reference various contracts or subawards or whatever, and say this MOU applies to those. So that's also an option.
Are there any other thoughts from folks after seeing this and hearing this? Because I know we only got about 5 minutes left.
Well, just to let you know that the interinstitutional assurance that goes through all
I think we lost you, Axel.
Yeah.
Where'd he go? And he's unmuted. Oh, he's gone. His internet probably went away too.
Well, maybe you can write something later.
Yeah. So since we're at the, you know, getting toward the tail end, and since this is a working group, I'm curious, and thank you so much for going through this, Alice. I'm wondering if it's given people additional thoughts about some of our next steps. I know that one of the things that we talked about was, as a next step, starting off with guidance. And I'm wondering how we define what kind of guidance you feel that you and other institutions need. Or, you know, since we're looking at this with fresh eyes, are we looking at this MOU and saying, this is something I didn't really consider before? Is it possible that the FDP or this working group can develop something that's that's simple that can be used? I'm just curious with some initial thoughts here. Or are you still not sold? Are you still not sold on a separate MOU, or let's hear what people are thinking.
So can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, good. This is Carol. So just really quickly, as I mentioned before, our inspection guide kind of provides guidance on this. And I mean, the whole thing that you should be worried about is that if you come in and regardless of whether it's an MOU or whatever, things are not spelled out, both institutions will be cited. And I'm not sure, now this is the one thing I don't know, like if you get a citation, does that affect what monies you get, or, you know, but certainly it's publicity that you don't need, because that inspection report is for public knowledge. So I think when people are crafting these things, they need to be sure that everything is covered and understand that whatever is a gray area there, both institutions are going to get cited for it. And they will both get they'll get a report for that. So, you know, that's one guidance, is to offer our inspection guide to take a look at that and just make sure that that doesn't happen.
I guess another thing is, you know, what should go in the MOU, or like, what are the minimum elements?
Well, we say that who's responsible for the semi-annual inspection, who's responsible for the husbandry, who's responsible for doing the annual report. You know, those are the basic ones. It's usually the care and husbandry that get people in trouble.
Someone wrote a comment. I feel like the chart in the VA presentation was very clarifying for me as to when a subboard agreement, IIA, and MOU should be used. I would find that clarification helpful in guidance. Okay, the VA MOU is great for a general institutional MOU, such as between a local VA and a university. To use this every time we have a subboard is not likely to be tenable with current staffing, at least for us. Me too, someone says. Agree. Yes. Yes.
So I agree that I think to try to do this MOU for each individual subaward probably is just too burdensome. And that's why, so it's really intended to be a single document for the relationship between two institutions, and not necessarily, I mean, the cases where we have had it be specific to one investigator or one project is when the institutions don't intend to collaborate on anything else, and they want to make sure that nothing else happens besides this one. So it wouldn't be, it would really be burdensome to have a separate one for each of a whole bunch of projects.
Indeed. Okay, since I know we're out of time, we have to think through some next steps. What are the next steps? And I'd like to hear from you as well in the audience what you think that should be, since this is a working group and we don't want to like dictate where you want it to go. And maybe we're still at the learning phase of this, and maybe you need a little bit more time to absorb what you've seen to potentially play around with it and see how it can fit either with some type of FDP template, either a new one, or whether this goes with the subboard. And for me, I'm still having trouble with that, because I think the intention here is so different than what the intention of the subboard is. Any thoughts? Do you have any thoughts, co-chairs?
I think that point is really important, that the intention of both documents is so different. I think it goes back to that part at the beginning of the conversation about what kind of contract mechanism should we be using in each circumstance. I think what's interesting about the request to put the MOU and the subaward together is it does reduce some elements of administrative burden, But as a lot of people have said, you know, it adds time, it adds that extra step that maybe people aren't trained and staffed for. So that's always a really interesting nexus for me about this kind of working group, is figuring out what is a good practice, maybe not the best practice, but what are all the good practices that are out there, even if we don't call one best, and how do we get people more familiar with this issue so that people have a little bit more capacity to weigh in on it? Because I think when we started these conversations, even for me, when I started these conversations, I really didn't understand what I was being asked, because each document is covering such a specific transaction.
And we got another comment here that she likes the idea of referencing the MOU in the contract and vice versa. Putting the two together may not be efficient when subcontracts are in a different area than the IACUC. Yep. And another one, I think institutional MOU is helpful, but sometimes it does not work for all situations. I still feel a single MOU for each project works for our institution better. Another thought. Okay. Where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? I think maybe what we want to do is we're definitely going to want another work group meeting and maybe get on a bit more of a regular schedule for us to continue the conversation. And maybe by the time we have our next meeting, and how soon should we have it is the question, with all of our institutions in various stages of ramp up. Various stages of ramp up is how often should we meet? Oh, this is an interesting question for OLAW. Can we get solid guidance from OLAW as to whether an MOU is truly necessary if there is no collaboration with respect to the care, husbandry of the animals, or if we're silent that the default is that the subrecipient is responsible for the animals?
Well, if it's like an IIA, then right, the subrecipient is totally responsible. There's no need for an MOU. And if there's no working with animals between the two places, it's probably not necessary. It's when there's movement of animals or movement of people.
Okay. I see. Movement of animals and people between the two institutions in the care of the animals. But if they're kind of doing their own thing with the animals, then it may not be necessary.
So Stephanie, this is Alice. I was wondering whether the strategy that we used in the MOU might be something you could use. That is, you've got your subaward, and it sounds like some people like the idea of including the MOU in there and some people don't. So can you just make it like, here's what you would put in if you want it with the subaward, and you can delete this if you don't want it?
I'm mulling it over.
So I think that's a wonderful thought for sure. But I think one of the things that we hear consistently is that if some group is putting the MOU into their subaward and another member is not, it kind of ends up adding burden at some institutions while other institutions are reducing burden. And, you know, because the institutions that are receiving that subaward, they may not have the connection and the communication channel from their IACUC to their sponsored programs office. Or am I misunderstanding the question? Sorry.
I think you got it. One more person. I'm not convinced the MOU terms need to be incorporated into the subcontract, but rather to maybe tweak the subaward drop down for this section to include the parties agree to enter an MOU agreement. That's an interesting thought. Additionally, my institution includes in its subawards that the pass-through entity acknowledgement and MOU are done prior to execution of the subaward agreement. But those MOU acknowledgement is handled separately by IACUC staff from the subaward staff. So I see what she's saying. So basically, you could put a drop down in the subaward that they've entered into a separate MOU, and at her institution, they don't issue subawards unless the MOU is signed first. And someone wrote, I like this suggestion. And here's another one. The MOU language could be drafted and guidance say that it could be added to the contract or kept separate based on the needs of the institution. I mean, much like a lot of the other things we're doing, like the DTUA and the, oh, there's something else. Okay. So Amanda and friends, do we think that we just want to schedule another call in a couple of weeks while folks mull this over?
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right. So I'm not 100% sure when, but obviously we don't want to let too much time pass. Hopefully in the next 2 to 4 weeks. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a reasonable, yeah.
Wonderful. All right. So that's what we'll do. And we'll get some type of doodle poll going, and then we'll get it scheduled. So thank you, Alice. Thank you, everyone, for staying late. Any final words? Nope.
Nope. Thank you.
Thank
and again,
you.
Thanks, Alice.
You're welcome.
Yes. Thank you, Alice. That was great. So we did record this session. I don't know where I'm going to put it yet, but we'll put it somewhere.
And I'll send the slides to Stephanie so you can post those, or if anybody asks for them, you can send them out.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.